Okay, buenas tardes, everyone. Buenas tardes means good afternoon for the bilingually challenged. So I'm Dr. Alvaro Huerta. I'm an associate professor here at Cal Poly Pomona, and I'm also a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. And we have a fabulous presenter today, and I'm just going to read off a little bit, just some of her different hats that she wears, and then she can go ahead and talk a little bit about herself and go into the presentation. So for the sake of time, we're gonna keep this, at least my end, brief, and have Johanna take it away. And for the first 45 minutes or so, she'll be talking about the theme of her book and other ideas that she has she's a designer, an urbanist, an author, USC Fellow. I went to UCLA, so I won't use it against you. A past instructor at UC Berkeley. I actually went to Berkeley too, and where I received my PhD in Department of City Regional Planning. So I feel a connection with Johanna, and really excited to be here. I know we have a lot of people here today, and we're also going to share this link after. For those of you who are interested in design, in urbanism, and everything that Johanna has to offer. So take it away, Johanna.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alvaro. I am going to quickly share my screen because a lot of this talk is going to be visual. So like Alvaro so kindly said, I am Johanna Hoffman. Primarily, in addition to some of the other hats that I wear, I'm the founder and director of planning at Design for Adaptation, which is a studio using strategic planning and speculative design to survey the impacts of potential futures and spur proactive adaptation. And I'll be diving in this talk into the work and research that's behind my new book, which focuses on how speculative design, fiction, and storytelling tactics can be used to address long-standing issues in urban development. Specifically, I get into the field of speculative futures and how its associated storytelling and design tools can serve as practical approaches for creating the urban resilience that this century really demands. I want to start off by acknowledging how intense the past 2 years have been since I began writing this book. We've weathered the death, the isolation, the continuing economic fallout of COVID. We're going through scales of political unrest in this country and beyond that we haven't seen for a long, long time. Drought in the West for sure, where I am, where I assume a lot of you guys are, down in Pomona, has become more drastic and widespread. This is a shot of water levels at California's Lake Oroville last summer, which is a critical water storage reservoir for the state of California. Because of the region's worsening drought, water levels dropped to 20% of the reservoir's capacity. For me, this image is a visual reminder of how 20th century systems are not up to the task of providing for 21st century life, because it's becoming clearer that the upheaval of the last 2 years are really a preview of what is likely to come. Technological changes, ecological extinctions, political shifts that have impacted us so intensely in recent years are really only likely going to intensify, which highlights the fact that we can't necessarily look to the past as a template for what's coming. Creating more resilient development really demands looking beyond the logic of what we know to imagine what else can be. So given this pressing need for imagination, people in urban design and architecture could be leading the push for proactive adaptation, but for the most part, we're not. I say we because I'm a landscape architect and urban planner by training and experience. I didn't go to the Department of Urban and Regional Planning like Alvaro did, but I went just downstairs in the landscape architecture and urban planning program. Like me, others in the development sector, architects, planners, engineers, were trained to speculate about the future. We study, we apprentice to learn how to imagine projects that don't exist and figure out how to make them real. This is a shot of the Harbin Opera House designed by mad architects, and it's been recently lauded, and rightfully so, for pushing the boundaries of structural capacity. Like, it looks pretty cool, futuristic, innovative looking, right? Like all buildings, it started out as a figment of someone's imagination. Designers came up with a new approach for building, imagined what didn't exist, they modeled, they prototyped, they tested, and found ways to translate that approach into the physical world. All projects start as speculative realities until they're built. Despite these imagination-focused skill sets, however, emphasis in the development fields is more often placed on perpetuating the status quo. A lot of municipal planning departments are too underfunded, they're too understaffed to really be able to focus on promoting and enacting proactive change. Bureaucratic blockages can really make it that it's easier to push projects forward that have been done before. They're less risky. It makes it easier for them to get permitting, to get funding. Given the mounting uncertainties of the times that we live in, that trend is becoming increasingly dangerous. Now, for example, subdivisions are still regularly built in high-risk fire areas with minimal protections in place. This image is a shot of Coffee Park, which is a community in Santa Rosa, California, after it was burned down by a fire in 2017. Systems for building new housing are still largely based on supporting population sizes and density levels that made sense decades ago, which has made construction rates slow to the point where our houselessness crisis is exploding. Building in floodplains is still common practice. This is a shot of Western Germany from a flood that devastated the region in the summer of 2021. This is New York City in 2021 during flooding from Hurricane Ida. This is Kentucky just this past summer. The mounting severity of these trajectories and events stem in part from the fact that we're in a crisis of limited imagination. We have limited imagination about what our cities are, the intensity of the conditions that they're facing, and what we need them to be in coming decades. That limited imagination is in part the result of a long-standing trend in urban development that sees the future largely as a place to be predicted and controlled. And given today's scales, scopes, and speeds of change, that kind of thinking is faulty. Summer temperatures are going to continue to spike higher than existing cooling systems have been designed to handle. Rain, when it comes, is going to fall at more intense rates. Even with the best research and foresight, urban life is going to continue to morph in ways that are beyond prediction. The past, again, is not a sufficient template for what lies ahead. We also have limited imagination about whose visions should be valued in city making. That trend perpetuates urban development's long legacies of exclusion because for generations, the work of making cities has actively limited public participation to minimize opposition and accelerate built work. And many communities have been dismissed, disenfranchised, and displaced as a result, setting the stage for a lot of the social and economic inequalities that plague so many cities today. A lot of you might be familiar with the phenomenon of urban renewal that shaped so much of 20th century development in the US and abroad. And it was a mode of cleaning up what at the time were often denser cities to make them greener, more spacious, what urbanists at the time thought would be better places to live. And many of these redevelopments focused on communities of color, the residents of which were rarely consulted and often displaced in the process. This picture is an image from a demolition zone in the Hill District of Pittsburgh in 1957 in an area of historically African-American neighborhoods. So in the years since, this kind of development has been increasingly decried, which is great, but its effects live on. Researcher Mindy Foley-Love described the lasting impacts of the displacement caused specifically by urban renewal as root shock. And in her words, people were stripped of their roots, forced without aid, to struggle through the period of shock to replant themselves as best they might. And in doing so, we're less able to build the economic and social wealth that less impacted communities were often able to create. So generational wealth was less available, making the impacts of urban renewal, again, resound still very loudly. It means that when new projects are built, particularly in communities of color, gentrification and displacement often go with them. That's what happened with this project shown in this image. It's at the SoFi Stadium in Inglewood in LA. And when it was originally pitched, part of its promotion was that it would bring jobs and revenue to the area, predominantly Black and brown neighborhood. A lot of gentrification has occurred in addition. And I've sadly found in projects that I've worked on as a professional over the years that community displacement is still considered as an occasionally necessary evil. Urban development still often returns to what's familiar, to employing imagination to persuade others that what's proposed is the necessary path forward. And when imagination is a means for persuasion and development, the benefits are rarely evenly distributed. because presenting futures as predictable as prime forums for persuasion requires grounding them in today's logic. When we operate within the confines of conventional wisdom, envisioning alternative trajectories becomes really hard because environmental degradation is progressing at increasingly rapid rates. It's easy to assume that total devastation is going to be inevitable because exclusive Western planning is still the widespread norm. Pushing for collaboration can feel impossible because privatization and deregulation have dominated Western societies for decades. A lot of us can't picture a future without them. This image is a neighborhood in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where the country's income inequalities are directly adjacent and particularly obvious. And when we become so used to the inequities that create situations like this, it can be hard to acknowledge that alternative paths forward might be achieved. Placing borders around our collective imagination makes longstanding issues appear increasingly intractable and dystopian futures much more inevitable by the day. Given how dark current conditions can feel at times, it's easy to understand why imagining alternatives or enacting desired change might feel so difficult. This is a shot of San Francisco in the fall of 2020 when there was so much smoke in the air from wildfires going on in the area that the sky literally turned orange. I was there in the Bay that day and it was darker and stranger and scarier than any sci-fi apocalyptic film I've ever seen because it was real, it was scary, it was sad, and it felt like it was hard to remember that Armageddon wasn't guaranteed to last forever. But the truth is that it's not. The future is not a given. And if we don't want dystopia to be our inevitable futures, we have to think differently and more creatively about what can be. The things that we picture in our minds are what we're more primed to accept, to embrace, to enact. And if we want more resilient cities, we need to shake off the limits that we place on our own imaginations. We need to embrace the fact that we all have the ability to imagine futures that we want for ourselves. When we use our imaginations to cultivate that kind of self-determination, we're better equipped to create the cities that work not just for the few, but for all of us. So the field of speculative futures offers some powerful ways to do that. Many of you in the audience are maybe familiar with these tools. I'm not going to spend too much time going over them. I'm just going to give you a broad overview of a few different approaches. In general, they are ways of creating high resolution visions of potential realities. They're really about collapsing the distance between tomorrow and today, helping us reflect on the ramifications of potential change in order to inform the decisions that we make now. So a well-known version of one type, which is called science fiction prototyping, comes from Star Trek. This is for sure a culty show that came out in the 60s, and it's also a place where a lot of tools that we now use daily, tablet computers, devices that translate language as it's being spoken, were shown in their earliest version. So people saw these visions of tools, were inspired by them, and really looked to them as templates to make the tools that we now use, again, on such a regular basis. World building is another kind of speculative futures approach. This is an image from the movie Minority Report, which was set in a future time frame around 2050-ish. The film didn't have a script to begin with. The filmmakers behind this film had to build the world first, and to build the world, filmmakers had to research what this time frame could be, not just the technologies that might be used, but the political systems, ecological context, the infrastructural interdependencies, the cultural norms. And the film was so successful at grounding what at the time were really fringe areas of research. Responsive targeted advertising, for example, touchscreen technologies were not widespread, that it led to hundreds of patents in the following years, because again, people could see how these seemingly abstract concepts really applied to and could be implemented and affect our everyday lives. But world building is an ancient practice. It's part of cultures all over the world. Aztecs in Latin America did this work. Norse gods of Scandinavia come from world building that was done by entire societies. It's something that cultures all over the world have some kind of connection and exposure to. These days, speculative futures sometimes are developed to be more experiential. Sometimes that's an analog form. Sometimes it's using digital tools. One example that I've been diving into recently is called Bidibon First Light. which is by First Nation artist Lisa Jackson. It's a VR exploration of the city of Toronto as it might occur in coming decades as it's really impacted by climate change. So you put on these VR goggles and you explore a city, a future Toronto that is warmer, that's more flooded. There are animals making their homes in different skyscrapers. People are building gardens on city rooftops. And as you move through this space, you hear the languages of different First Nation peoples who have lived there over the centuries, Wendat, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk. And so as you explore this potential future, you're also connected to different aspects of the city's past. Another approach is design fiction. These are typically ways of creating prototypes of tools that might occur in a given scenario. One example of design fiction that I love is a project called Ayaba Repository. It's a 2016 effort by the artists Ayodamolo Akusende and Salome Asega. They created the project as a museum and a resource library of artifacts that affirm the futures of Black people. So if people are interested or excited about Afrofuturism, this is one such project for sure that's influenced by that very long-standing movement. So Asego and Akusende got together with different community members and brainstormed what are objects that Black people need to thrive in coming years, and then they made those objects in physical form. Another speculative futures tactic is speculative design. So this is a forum for using design to challenge assumptions and current conditions and conventions. This is a project from Hyphen Labs, Neurospeculative Afrofeminism Salon, which re-envisioned a Black hair salon as a lab for neurocosmetology and cognitive enhancement. So it challenged the idea of what we think a Black hair salon can be, and it did so in high resolution form. Some speculative futures tools use tactics that are more simple. This is a project by the artist Candy Chang. She'd done a series after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in the mid-2000s, where she covered buildings that had been abandoned and boarded up in the aftermath of the event with stickers that asked people to add their ideas of what they wish those buildings were instead. So this project gets to the simplicity, the heart of speculative futures. They're tools to ask what if, and then why not? What else can exist in place of what is here right now? And then why is that potential future condition not a reality yet? So it's a way of, again, envisioning the future and then taking us back to the present moment to identify trajectories and strategies that we might want to take in order to get to that potential alternative future forward. So this process of actively engaging with the future in personal high resolution ways is something that researchers find increase our resilience as individuals and also as societies. When we engage with what could be, we become psychologically stronger. When people imagine the future, their efforts are promoted by a set of brain circuits that juxtapose time and space to help us getting beyond, to think beyond the here and now. And when we imagine what the future could be, the stronger our abilities to engage with those longer timeframes ends up becoming. The farther into the future we start to look, the more frequently we challenge current conventions and assumptions. The more we challenge those assumptions, the more our senses of autonomy and resilience end up expanding. So doing so makes us more resilient as individuals. The more we imagine the future together, the more socially resilient we become. So social resilience is often defined as a community's ability to tolerate, absorb, and adapt to different social and environmental hazards. And researchers are finding that just as important as ecological and infrastructural resilience is, social resilience is really just as critical. So the picture, this image is of Chicago's 1995 heat wave, which was an event that killed hundreds of people across the city. And studies have found in the decades since that neighborhoods that weathered the event more safely, where less people died, were those where residents knew each other. They were socially resilient by being socially connected. So while infrastructural resilience can take large amounts of time and funds to achieve, social resilience, our connections to each other, the institutions that hopefully support us, is a much more immediate opportunity that still has very serious impact. And researchers found that stronger degrees of collaboration and reciprocity are effective means of enhancing social resilience. Collaboration both deepens trust and connection. And it also lays the ground for self-determination, all of which is critical to enhancing resilience. This graphic is from a paper published late last year, and it assessed community resilience in the face of COVID-related impacts. And as researchers tried to articulate with this graphic, the takeaway was that working together is the through line that creates more sustainable, resilient development. Another way to say working together is collaboration. So again, when practiced across communities, working with the future can help us build that social resilience. When we imagine different kinds of futures as a collaborative process, the results augment our adaptive capacities. Developing those shared visions requires and also builds trust, which cultivates the kind of connections that can help us as society start to weather the unpredictable. So speculative futures tactics help us build these connections in a few different ways. One is by cultivating possibility through play. One example of what this can look like comes from a project called the Republic of Columbus, Spain. It was an effort led by artist Jorge Manos Rubio while working in Columbus, Spain, which is a neighborhood in West Amsterdam. Residents in that area come from a lot of different cultural backgrounds, which has resulted in some conflict over the years. There's been some drug dealing, some violence. And after trying more traditional measures to address these tensions, local governments started asking artists and designers to employ more creative interventions. So Manos Rubio worked with residents to come up with the idea of turning the local square, which was a focus of a lot of these conflicts, into a micronation. And this micronation concept, it was Rubio's extension of stuff that was already happening on site. He did a lot of just hanging out in the neighborhood to think through, make connections, understand what was going on. And he was playing with some kids on the basketball court one day, and he saw all these lines intersecting on the ground, and the pattern reminded him of these strong graphics that are often used on national flags, which made him think of nation states. And then he started to wonder, wait, what if this neighborhood was its own micronation? So Rubio came up with this micronation kind of on his own, a little bit brainstorming with other people, but he used different experiential tools, different speculative futures approaches to invite locals to flesh it out, to really inhabit it. So the neighborhood was no longer just a part of West Amsterdam, but it was a country in its own right. Like, what did that mean? How were they going to articulate how life in the square as a micronation was just different from life in the square previously? So they used design fiction, experiential futures, and world building to start to do that. They made their own money. They made a passport. They developed stamps. They created a national space agency that used high-tech kites to test future rocket launches and went to go visit the European Space Agency. They created their own Olympic sports teams. As the months progressed, the public square became a sanctioned micronation, acknowledged both in Amsterdam and by other micronations around the world. And it was a place where residents could imagine that they were citizens of their own shared nation state and then live out the ramifications of doing so in real time. So again, this exercise in world building fleshed out by these different speculative futures tools like design fiction, like experiential futures. They were ways of making this alternative reality something that existed in the present, this high resolution depiction of an alternative reality. And it was a way of stepping out of the problem space that existed in that present moment in Columbus Spain and play with the possibility space that the future offers us. Because again, it's not guaranteed, it hasn't happened yet. Like, we don't know that it's going to continue to have the same problems as today. That's not a given. So reframing the neighborhood as a nation with its own customs and identity was a way of reorienting residents' relationships to the square and to each other. It was a form of play that generated connection and cooperation between factions that were previously at odds with each other. And this is not to say that this project solved all of Columbus Spain's problems, like it didn't, but it created a context for new possibilities to be explored and trust between disparate factions to start to deepen. And it did it in a collaborative, co-created kind of way. Speculative futures invite us to not just think about what the future could become, but to feel it. There are ways of making the future deeply personal. This is a shot from the 2017 project called Future Energy Lab, which was created by the studio Superflux for the government of the United Arab Emirates. So Superflux created a series of interactive experiential futures installations with the goal of influencing the country's long-term energy policies. That was the job that they were hired to do. So they created different speculative experiential future scenarios to explore different energy use scenarios for the UAE in coming decades. They made an energy simulator, they developed a role-playing game, they made different interactive design fiction objects so that the prime decision makers, which included the prime minister of the country, head of cabinet, the Ministry of Energy, could explore what different energy decisions, what they wanted to continue with dependence on fossil fuels or use a different combination of renewable energy sources in the future, where that might take them. So in one scenario, people got to smell the air that would occur if current fossil fuel emissions rates continued. And it was a pretty noxious mix of carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide. It smelled like rotten eggs. It was an experience that allowed people to not just think about air quality, but to feel it. Soon after the project's completion, the UAE announced its national energy strategy for up to the year 2050, which allocated $163 billion for investment in renewables. And it's not clear what exact role the Future Energy Lab project played in enacting that choice, but the prime decision makers for the strategic plan were all participating in the lab installation. And it articulates some of the power that comes from how, and I'm borrowing a phrase from another designer and futurist named Stuart Candy here, that speculative futures help us to not just see into the future, to think about it, but to feel into the future. And that process of feeling into the future can help us relate to coming decades as the personal spaces that they inherently are. They're places where we will be living when we're older, or our children or grandchildren will be living. When we connect to the future from that personal place, it can be a different way of relating to them as the dynamic spaces, a possibility that they inherently are, rather than the static conditions that we often think of them as being. So speculative futures are powerful ways of also balancing long-term and short-term thinking. It can be hard to find balance between the parts of our brain that work with long-term vision and those other parts that are targeted towards the short, towards the here and now. Because speculative futures focuses on narratives that are linked to the specific and the personal, often they can be strong ways of creating that kind of balance. So one example of what this can look like is a project from 2010 called Europa. It used speculative design for an exploration of what Europe might look like in 2050. So it was part of a vision document funded by the European Climate Foundation and developed by architect Rem Koolhaus's firm called OMA. And the project depicted a future that was based on renewable energy production. So all of Europe's old boundaries were dissolved and they were replaced by new fictional states that were shaped by the types of renewable energy that each region generated. So, Europe, it's all looking different. Spain is gone. It's now part of a larger, state region called Solaria. Hydropia is the hydropower generating part of the continent. And all of these different states are connected by a centralized energy grid. The grid serves to redistribute renewable energy across the continent according to season. So you've got most of your energy in the summertime coming from the solar producing states in the south, and the north that gets replaced by wind, tidal energy from the north. And it's a scenario where Europe's carbon emissions have been dropped by 80% from 1990 levels, and the continent is almost entirely energy dependent or independent. So it's obviously fanciful, and it's also based on detailed research. So the team who developed this in its early stages included researchers from McKinsey, Imperial College London, Oxford Economics, and they created a whole technical economic analysis of energy rates, greenhouse gas emissions, infrastructure conditions across Europe. And what they found was that the EU, and this was before Brexit, was both the world's third largest greenhouse gas producer, and they also pursued sustainable energy initiatives in a pretty haphazard way, like huge solar farms in dark parts of Germany, wind farms in areas off the coast of Italy where there's little wind. So Europa became a whole-scale redesign of the entire continent to ameliorate those ineffective ways of pursuing renewable energy harvesting, reaching across the Mediterranean to include North Africa as well. And it's not a viable plan. It was never intended to be. Reorganizing an entire continent, not just by energy infrastructure, but by geopolitical borders, is definitely crazy. Like, it's out there. This was designed to provoke discussion. It was also designed to serve as a framework to assess the technical and economic kinds of feasibility of achieving really large-scale emissions reductions. It was a long-term vision that became a tool to assess what short-term goals could look like. So instead of providing a kind of concrete destination that the designers of this project were insisting and persuading people to go after, it was about asking, if we're going to realize massive reductions in 40 years, what could we do now? So it was a means of finding a plausible pathway to achieve a really ambitious aim and push our collective imagination of what we think is possible to do so. So speculative futures tactics like world building are also powerful, in part because they help us find shared language. This image is from a project that I worked on in 2019 and 2020 called Future World Vision. And I worked on this with the World Building Studio Experimental Design and the American Society of Civil Engineers. And together we built an interactive educational virtual reality video game where participants could engage with a vision of what urban life in 2070 could become and cultivate discussion and feedback on preferred trajectories of change. We created it in collaboration with a range of stakeholders and experts in diverse fields, so people like material scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, community organizers were invited to use the virtual storytelling space as a nexus to find common ground and share ideas about what they thought these future trajectories could lead to. And we did it in part by framing the city as a kind of question, again, a provocation, because it was created primarily for professional engineers and students to play to understand issues that their projects and their professional trajectories could encounter over the next half century. It was designed to ask questions like, how are construction materials and technologies changing? And what do transit systems look like in 50 years? So along with the larger team at Experimental, I led research on the effort. And because the point of world building is to understand potential worlds in a holistic way, we dug into research in cultural, political, ecological, and economic factors, and tried to understand how the findings would impact people at a range of scales, all the way down from the larger city down to the individual. And again, talking to people in nuclear fusion, solar power, epidemiology, sociology can sometimes be tough because they all speak really different languages, but our goal was really to conduct spaces where people from these different backgrounds could talk together. So part of that was workshops to see where people from, areas of different expertise agreed, disagreed. We would organize our findings according to different focus areas that different people were excited to explore, and then again, relate them as different scales. So doing a visual orientation of how seemingly disparate perspectives and research started to affect and be in a relationship with each other. We wrote science fiction about people's daily lives to synthesize different perspectives and research that we were doing and identify the range of experiences that actual, residents of this fictional 2070 future might experience. And that was a way, again, of synthesizing seemingly disparate pieces of research, of feedback into a narrative context where daily life still goes on. Like we still want to go and get food to eat. We're still going to be trying to find people to date. We're still going to be trying to, take our kids to school. What do those contexts look like? And then we'd share our findings with collaborators on an ongoing basis. What did they think of some of these stories? What did they, what ideas sparked from some of this research? And then we started to translate how these ideas could visually manifest in these virtual spaces. How did the city then change across scales? Multifunctional transit corridors are going to have to function at the city scale for sure, but they also influence life at the ground level. How did these scales impact each other? And what did people think about those impacts? So as our city got more detailed, we could ask collaborators deeper questions. We get more nuanced feedback from stakeholders to understand how the proposals impacted them, how realistic they were, what issues arose, what challenges, what might need to be changed. So this process of iteration and communication over time created a context where people from disparate backgrounds could speak an increasingly shared language, and that video game space became a forum for collaboration, for dialogue, and different aspects of co-creation. So speculative futures are powerful in that they can also move us beyond aiming for more participation in the way that projects and urban development is done to co-creation. So what example of what this looks like in practice comes from also Los Angeles, a lot of projects focused in LA. The Sankofa City project ran from 2014 to 2019 in the South Los Angeles neighborhood of Leimert Park, which is a site of a lot of discussion about gentrification and cultural displacement. So this was initiated by Leimert Park residents and students from USC's Department of Cinematic Arts, and it built on a lot of years of collaboration between the school and the neighborhood. Rather than letting gentrification accelerate more or less unchallenged, local residents wanted to see how they could use creative placemaking, creative collaboration to strengthen the neighborhood's sense of identity and cultivate a stronger sense of cultural connection that new arrivals might be able to understand, embrace, and support. So the goal was really to spark public conversations about what alternative futures could look like when they're tied to local culture. What role did people want new technology to play in their lives? What could everyday life look like once things like augmented reality or autonomous vehicles were widespread? So the project became this space to kind of collectively imagine the future of the neighborhood and explore what everyday life might look like when tools like augmented reality, like autonomous cars, were widespread, instead of using local feedback to shape urban space, what this future could be like. Sankofa, this project used world building, it used design fictions, it used speculative design to reimagine what shaping space really meant. So it was about this serious play activity becoming an opening for shaping different kinds of futures. So as the workshops progressed, participants started playing with the idea that their neighborhood was not just a future vision of Leimert Park, but it was it was another place entirely, which they called Sankofa City. And it would have some primary values they decided, like community-based policing. It would have gardening and education that was a use also for placemaking. It would have complementary autonomous cars that people could use and get around the neighborhood for free. It would have publicly accessible augmented reality projections that would also share different stories of local history. So with each session of these iterative workshops, participants deepen those ideas through design fictions, building toys, props, digital models. They made film shorts. And the visions that they generated gave residents more cohesive ideas about how they wanted Leimert Park to transform, and a different kind of agency in advocating for their preferences. In the final presentation, which they made to a community stakeholder group, it became a forum for dialogue about long-term strategies for how to integrate new technologies in the neighborhood and strengthen its identity over time. And local residents are building on the visions created by those workshops, specifically creating free autonomous shuttles for the neighborhood. A longtime resident of Leimert Park and a leader of the project, a guy named Ben Caldwell, is spearheading initial pilot tests to see how a larger fleet of autonomous vehicles could be introduced over time, and is also using the opportunity to double as skill building spaces for local youth, which again is a big example of the power of creating visions and narratives that are rooted in place, when stories belong to us, when they come from our own lives and show the reality of what it means to live in our neighborhoods, our communities. We're inherently more connected to what those stories show us. We can push generated ideas, therefore, oftentimes more effectively to the next level of positive impact. Because the ways that we imagine the future fundamentally impact the products, the infrastructure, and for sure the cities that we create. The phenomenon of 20th century urban renewal that I touched on in the beginning of this talk was inspired in large part by a guy named Ebenezer Howard and his 19th century visions of what he called the Garden City. The Garden City, in turn, was heavily shaped by a science fiction fantasy story written by a guy named Edward Bellamy, which was called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. He wrote it about Boston, envisioning it in the year 2000 as a socialist utopia. And it was a big deal when it came out. It was the third largest bestseller of its time. And Howard was so inspired by its descriptions of peaceful streets and orderly stores that he came up with the Garden City suburban idea, which again impacted and shaped and pushed forward the urban renewal phenomenon that really shaped so much of 20th century cities, like what we imagine has real world impact. These days, our collective imagination about the future skews pretty dystopian. We see it in the movies that are out there, the books that are available, definitely the news media stories that are often shared. And that dystopian dominance is a problem, with existing visions of the future skewing so far, so often in the apocalyptic direction. It can become really difficult to believe that more adaptive planning might be possible. Because if we don't push against these dystopian visions, if we don't challenge them as not being guaranteed, but just one option of how things could go, they do become real life. One of my favorite movies is Blade Runner, came out in the 1980s. And it's a great film. And it's also really dark. Like, it is not a happy, positive, equitable vision of where urban life can go. In the years since it came out, it's a visual designer, a guy named Sid Mead, who crafted the Blade Runner aesthetic, was visiting the Gulf region regularly to consult on building projects before he died in 2019. And its influence extends much farther around the world. The image on the left of this slide is Blade Runner from 1982, and the image on the right is Beijing in 2013. So the question becomes, what kind of futures do we want to imagine for ourselves? Because those are the futures that we are definitely more likely to create. So there are a lot of ways of doing this work, but some powerful, impactful ones often follow a process that emphasizes the process of engagement first. Who are we working with as our collaborators over time? If you're an individual doing this work, are you brainstorming with your neighbors who you are going to be collaborating with over the coming years? If you're a city planning department, can you coordinate with impacted communities and build off existing strong and hopefully trusting relationships? How is the work embedded? Are there champions who can motivate to facilitate the work and energize its development and execution over time, particularly in the places where its impacts will be felt the most? When we're exploring, it's about collectively identifying the what if questions that we can use to shape how we want to dive into potential risks, drivers of change, unforeseen disruptions. When we envision, we pick these different speculative futures approaches that we can use to translate data into fiction, to take facts into, again, visions in these high resolution ways of what can be, and then evaluating what the impacts of those visions could become. How do we refine the findings and then iterate on possible futures as a result until consensus is reached on what a preferred trajectory might be, and then enacting by identifying the steps to take to translate that desired future into reality and implementation. The process is really best when it's iterative, taking the time again to go back and forth, especially between the envision and evaluate steps as a way of revealing impacts and repercussions of potential futures and lays the ground for identifying and agreeing upon preferred trajectories over time. There are different opportunities to integrate these tools into different scales of our society and different roles that stakeholders can take to push that forward. This is not happening on widespread levels yet, but there are interesting moves that some of these different case studies that I explore in this book and some of my own work show that there's potential to grow in different areas. On the governmental side, that can look like creating centers in municipal, regional, or state systems to provide places for imaginative co-creation to occur on an ongoing basis, and then to translate findings from those visions into planning initiatives, policy recommendations, infrastructural interventions. If you're an NGO or a research institution, that role of acting as mediator can be powerful, particularly with communities who may have been disfranchised by government actors over different periods of time. Also translating research, not just into papers, but using speculative futures approaches to make research multisensory and therefore more personal can be a way of active education of how we can understand a lot of these future trajectories that are coming very quickly down the pike. With the private sector, a lot of funding opportunities for education can be a powerful way of just ensuring that this work is available, supported, and has the money that it needs to happen over longer periods of time that oftentimes co-creation requires. And as individuals, we can think about the future in our own lives. What do we want our futures to become? And then find people who we might be able to collaborate with. That can happen on small scales in our own families. That can happen as students in classrooms. And now, obviously, with social media, the internet, there's a lot of other people out there who we can quite easily find if we're looking to initiate collaborations across different scales. So using speculative futures alone is not going to solve the many problems our cities face. This is not a series of silver bullets. They are not a panacea. Their power really depends on how they're harnessed and to what ends. But if we, all people who live in cities, can start to accept and engage with the fact that futures are constantly in flux, we can get closer to creating the more resilient spaces that we need to embrace what's headed our way. And really, they help us to not just recognize those inherently shifting contexts, but to empower us to actively imagine and again, co-create with others what they can be. The more we speculate about coming decades, the stronger we grow. And the stronger we grow, the more cooperative and resilient our urban spaces can become. They're about providing us with tools to imagine and then implement the future today, enabling us to create the resilient cities that we really need to meet the challenges of 21st century life. So I'm going to stop it there. And yeah, excited for questions, comments, all the rest.
That was fantastic. I was taking all these notes. Like, hopefully I passed your class. Applause, everybody. Everybody show some love. This is all volunteer work. Johanna is just helping us learn about design and her vision of how we can move forward as a society. Like I said, she's volunteering for this. This is something that is important to her, but at the same time, we need to recognize that. So I want everybody to show some love and applause.